Adenosine triphosphate. I want to start with this today to get us thinking about energy again. There are some features here that are very interesting, really, in terms of life in the universe. This is a 5-carbon sugar, ribose, and this is adenine here. So adenine is a nitrogen-containing base, right? And this is ribose, 5-carbon sugar. Now if I came over here and I stood like this so that all you could see was one phosphate group, like that, what is that? No, you can only see one phosphate. So it's a nitrogen-containing base and a 5-carbon sugar and a phosphate group. Does that look familiar to you? So very early in the semester, we learned the structures of organic macromolecules, right? So what does the structure of DNA look like, or RNA? So the backbone of the DNA molecule is a repeating sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, right? And in the middle of the ladder, that's the DNA molecule, you have a nitrogen-containing base that's base pairing with another base. And those bases were adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. You remember that? It's an interesting side note here, really, the structure of ATP. This, if I take those two phosphates off, this is a nucleotide that is used to build RNA. Very interesting to me. I'm not going to make more of it here, others have, but it's a very interesting observation. Now, what we said in class last time is that bond right there. So that P and those 3 O's, that is the terminal phosphate, and that's the terminal phosphate bond. So energy is in that bond right there for life. So all the energy stuff we're talking about is really focused right here on that terminal phosphate bond. Okay. So we did that. Now I want to use this to summarize again where the energy is, and then we're going to start through it. All right. Let's use this picture to put in your notes an outline for the major steps of energy production. This will help you remember it, okay? Let's put as step 1, let's put glycolysis. As step 2, for the outline, let's put the citric acid cycle. And as step 3, let's put the electron transport chain. So our outline is going to go like that. 3 steps: glycolysis, followed by the citric acid cycle, followed by the electron transport chain. All right, now, in your outline, in your 3-step outline, I want you to put a couple other things here. The first one I want you to put is, by glycolysis, I want you to put anaerobic. And then put a bracket around the other 2 and write the word aerobic. What I mean by that is the glycolytic pathway does not require oxygen, and the other 2 do require oxygen. So anaerobic and aerobic pieces, 3 major steps: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. Last thing, and then we'll start through it. In parentheses, by the electron transport chain, I want you to put oxidative phosphorylation. It's a big fancy science word, and I'm going to explain it at the end of this. Oxidative phosphorylation. If I say the word oxidative, you should think about something we ended class with. We talked about oxidation reduction reactions, right? So if it's oxidative, something's losing electrons, right? And if I use the word phosphorylation, you should immediately think something's getting a phosphate group added to it. So really, I love that explanation, and I'll do it again with you at the end. Oxidative phosphorylation is the process by which you oxidize the coenzyme, and you phosphorylate ADP to make ATP. Okay, so glycolysis, citric acid cycle, electron transport chain. All right, the first series of reactions that we looked at was this one. The anaerobic pathway we call glycolysis, converting the 6-carbon glucose into 2 3-carbon pyruvic acids. All right, so you do not need to memorize the steps of this reaction. You should be aware of the importance of 1,3-BPG. This one will come up again in your lives, so you know it's important because it binds to hemoglobin and causes oxygen to let go. So glucose is converted into pyruvate, 1,3-BPG is important, and the other real take-home message here is you have to use 2 ATPs to get the system started. You produce 4 ATPs as a result of that, for a net gain of 2 ATPs during the glycolytic pathway. All right, the second step, so we did this in class last time. The second step is a citric acid cycle. So this shows you the citric acid cycle. And once again, I do not expect you to memorize all the reactions of the citric acid cycle. Okay? So let's get it started, shall we? So in order to get the citric acid cycle started, pyruvic acid has got to be converted into acetyl-CoA. Pyruvic acid has got to be converted into acetyl-CoA. The 3-carbon pyruvic acid is going to be turned into a 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. Pyruvic acid is the product of glycolysis. Acetyl-CoA is the product of a reaction in which 1 carbon is removed and one of the coenzymes is reduced. Okay, so let's pause there. I mentioned this last time, but this is really important. So someone says to you, how do you make energy in the human body? Everybody gets a sense that you have to breathe in order to live. And everybody has a general sense that the reason we breathe is because we need oxygen and we need to get rid of carbon dioxide. Now, man, oh man, is there more to that story, right? But we got to start somewhere. So I have only mentioned in brief to you at this point the importance of oxygen. So let's do that one first. The reason we mentioned oxygen was because I told you if you do not have an oxidized version of this coenzyme, you cannot enter the citric acid cycle. And if you can't enter the citric acid cycle, pyruvic acid is going to be converted into lactic acid, right. So lactic acid is a product that is produced in my body whenever I don't have enough oxygen to make the energy I need. Specifically, I don't have enough oxygen to accept the electrons from the coenzymes. When you don't get the electrons off the coenzymes and they stay reduced, you cannot run aerobic respiration. You can't get the citric acid cycle started without them. So oxygen, as we will see again, is the final electron acceptor for energy production. All right, the other thing that you see here is carbon dioxide. So you say a person needs to breathe so they can get oxygen into their bodies and get carbon dioxide out. Why do they need to get oxygen in? And the real answer to that question is in order to receive the electrons from the coenzymes. The reactions that we need to run in order to make energy will not run if oxygen is not there as the final electron acceptor. Okay, so that's why I need oxygen. Now, what about the carbon dioxide? I need to get rid of it. Okay, so I know where the oxygen is going to be used. Where's the carbon dioxide produced? Okay, so this is the first place in metabolism where we see carbon dioxide being produced as a byproduct of metabolism. So we need to get rid of this carbon dioxide whenever it is produced. And the respiratory system is the primary mechanism for doing that. Now, if you have questions about the need for getting rid of carbon dioxide, I'm happy to address some of those today if you would like, but I promise you, if you'll stay with me for a few more months, you'll have some really good answers to that question. Why is carbon dioxide so bad? You know, if you take, whenever we euthanize animals, we had an animal use protocol committee in my graduate and postdoctoral work. We've got a committee here on this campus. If we euthanize an animal that's been used in experiments, say for immunology lab, we put them in a container and seal the container. And we blow carbon dioxide in there. And the animal just goes to sleep and passes away. So that illustration should point out to you at least one good reason why you need to be getting rid of this carbon dioxide. You don't want it in you, so we need to get rid of it. So carbon dioxide is going to be a very important piece of the rest of anatomy and physiology. It'll come up over and over and over again in different systems as we talk about pH balancing, as we talk about blood and heart, and on and on. In fact, we can relate it to skeletal muscle contraction as well. So in my summary, at the end of this, I'm going to go back and talk about energy one more time, and then talk about oxygen needs for muscles. I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to summarize it one more time at the end. Okay, so this is an important step. That's why I slowed down here. The conversion of pyruvic acid into acetyl-CoA is an important step. It will liberate or cause the production of carbon dioxide, and in order for the reaction to occur, you have to have an oxidized form of NAD. If it's not oxidized, if the electrons are on it, you can't run this reaction. And pyruvic acid will turn into lactic acid. All right. Now, the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA will join with a molecule called oxaloacetic acid that's 4 carbons and produce a 6-carbon molecule called citric acid, hence the name, the citric acid cycle. So I'm not going to ask you to memorize all the reactions, but you got to have the molecules in place to get it started. Acetyl-CoA joins with oxaloacetic acid. 2 plus 4 equals 6. The 6-carbon citric acid begins this cycle. Now, how many times, so if this is a series of reactions that occur here, how many times will I run the citric acid cycle reactions if I start with one glucose molecule? How many times will I run the citric acid cycle if I start with a single glucose? So in biochemistry, you have to track carbons. So you got to count carbons and account for the carbons everywhere you go. So the first thing you got to do is figure out where they've gone and how many you're using and that sort of thing. If you're going to count energy and count carbons, you got to keep track of this stuff. So this is a 6-carbon thing. This is a 3-carbon thing. Pyruvic acid comes from glucose, and how many pyruvates do you make from a single glucose? How many pyruvates do you make from a single glucose?
4.
There's glucose, there's pyruvate, and there's pyruvate. A 6-carbon glucose produces 2 3-carbon pyruvic acids. So 2 of these. So if you're counting carbons, you will run this cycle twice for each glucose. You make 2 pyruvic acids from glucose, you run the citric acid cycle twice. So when you start adding up energy numbers, you have to double these if you start with glucose in your formula. Okay, so 2 plus 4 is 6. I got a citric acid, I run the thing twice. Now, look at what happens during these reactions. During the citric acid cycle, I will produce 1, 2, 3 reduced NADs. I will produce 3 NADH plus H molecules with 1 trip through the citric acid cycle. So in just a moment, what happened there? Okay, so in just a moment, we're going to do this electron transport chain story and I'm going to do it with NADH. So I told you in class last time there are two coenzymes that hang on to electrons that are produced, they're reduced, if you will, during the reactions of metabolism. And they are the ones that are the energy carriers, really, because they're carrying electrons. So this one does NADH. You can see it running through the electron transport chain, and there are the electrons that are going to be transported along the electron transport chain. So during the citric acid cycle, you produce three of them. NADH plus H here, NADH plus H plus here, and NADH plus H here. Three of them. That's important. When you're going to add up total numbers of energy, you've got to think about how many reduced coenzymes you produce. The reactions of the citric acid cycle produce a single FADH2. So there are 4 reduced coenzymes produced during the citric acid cycle. 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2. Now the other thing that is a product of the citric acid cycle, 2 other things, is energy. This particular reaction here that you don't need to know the names of, one of the reactions in the citric acid cycle actually phosphorylates ADP. It's called a substrate level phosphorylation. Some of you had a good biology teacher in high school that taught you this. You actually make energy in these reactions. Now, looking around the reactions here in the Krebs cycle, you should see that there's no molecular oxygen. We have some water molecules in here for dehydration synthesis type behavior, but we don't have any, hydrolysis behavior, but we don't have any free oxygen molecules. So students who put on their outline that the citric acid cycle, did y'all hear me use Krebs? The bad habit. I learned it as the Krebs cycle years ago. Citric acid, that's the right name. Krebs is the guy's name. We don't give guys credit anymore. We call them what they are. This is citric acid cycle. So students who look at this say, okay, you told me that oxygen is necessary to do this, that these reactions, these citric acid cycle reactions, are aerobic, and you have to have oxygen for them. But I can look at the reactions and clearly see that they are not using oxygen. So how can you say reactions are requiring oxygen when they clearly do not require oxygen? Okay, the reason we say the citric acid cycle reactions are aerobic is because 4 of the reactions require oxidized coenzymes, which means without oxygen you can't run these reactions because oxygen has to take the electrons off of the reduced forms. So if there's no oxygen available, then you have all these reduced coenzymes and these reactions just won't happen. So it's true, but it's an indirect truth, right? The reason you need oxygen is because oxygen has to take the electrons. If the electrons are not taken, then you have reduced coenzymes and the reactions won't happen. So yes, it's aerobic, but it's no more aerobic than this reaction is. So this conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA is an aerobic reaction as well. You have to have oxidized NAD to make that happen. Okay, so NADH and FADH2, these are the major products. 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2. Now, the only other product to point out besides the energy made is one ATP made here. So with 1 glucose, you get 2 ATPs out of the citric acid cycle. You do not have enough energy to do anything. The only other product that you get out of this in places, you can see in a couple places here, is carbon dioxide. So the reactions of the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA and the reactions of the citric acid cycle produce the carbon dioxide that our bodies will have to get rid of in order to survive. Okay, so why do I need oxygen? Why do I need to get rid of carbon dioxide? The answers are all here in metabolism. In the production of energy, the answers are all in the production of energy. This is called cellular respiration. You say, I need to breathe because I need oxygen. For what? For this. I need to breathe because I got to get rid of carbon dioxide. For what? For this. All right, here's the last one. Step 3 in your handout, in your outline. The synthesis pathway for ATP here is the electron transport chain. Now, what do you have in parentheses here in your notes? Electron transport chain. Oxidative phosphorylation, okay? So before we walk through the process, let's see if the name fits. Okay, the first thing is it's called the electron transport chain. So I can see with these arrows electrons being transported. So in the electron transport chain name, I have the electrons from NADH plus H being transferred or transported to some other molecule. At that point, NAD becomes oxidized, and the first molecule here then becomes reduced. And then the electrons are transported to the next molecule, and this one is now oxidized, and this one is reduced. And then the electrons are transported here, and this one is reduced, and this one is oxidized. And the electrons, are you following me?
Yeah.
This is what we mean when we say oxidation reduction reactions. The transporting of electrons from one molecule to the other. Now, after this one is oxidized, here, you can give him some more electrons. Another NADH can come in here and hand its electrons off. And so each NADH plus H comes into the chain, which is found in the mitochondria. Let's look at it. Let's look at the picture. Go back and look at the picture. Here's the picture right here. There's another one. Now, this is the one right here. Okay, so the mitochondria looks like this. You can see the citric acid cycle, and here is the chain. Now, it's a little unfortunate, the cartoon, because the chain is actually in this membrane. The proteins that are oxidized and reduced are inside this membrane. But you can see here the transference of the electrons along this chain and ultimately reducing oxygen to make water, and loads of ATP. Okay, so we're not there yet. But this is happening in the mitochondria. The glycolytic pathway, glycolysis, happens out in the cytoplasm, and you do not need oxygen. It's anaerobic, right? It's anaerobic respiration, the glycolytic pathway, and you make a little bit of energy. Now, what's missing here? Should I have one of these drawn here? Yeah. So you do make an ATP in this by substrate level phosphorylation, similar to the way you do it here. So, but very little energy is made until you get to this point in the electron transport chain. All right, so let's look at it again. Here it is. So electron transport chain makes sense. It's also called oxidative phosphorylation. So let me show you. That's on this picture. So the first step here is to oxidize this molecule. Now, it could be FADH2 or NADH. The coenzyme has to be oxidized. So you hear the name? Oxidative. You must oxidize this thing to get this started. The next name is phosphorylation. So this is shown here. Adenosine diphosphate has a phosphate group added to it in an enzyme I'm going to tell you about. And when you do this, you activate this enzyme and you make lots and lots of energy. So there is your phosphorylation. You are phosphorylating ADP. You are oxidizing NADH and phosphorylating ADP. Oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain to make lots of energy. Okay, now let's finish this with the energy formation. There's one more piece. So I'm gonna go back to that picture with the mitochondria for just a moment, and then I'll come right back to this one, okay? So notice the presence of a protein enzyme here called ATP synthase. All right, so in this picture, right here, this electron transport chain is in this inner membrane, okay? So what is actually happening as these oxidative reduction reactions occur is the protons from those coenzymes are separated from their electrons. And the protons end up in this space between the inner and outer membrane. And you think, oh my word, how far do we have to go with this? Okay, this is an important outline piece of what's happening. The protons in this story build up inside this space between the inner and outer membrane of the mitochondria. And you generate, over the course of time, what's called a proton gradient. So while this is happening, go back. While this is happening, the electrons are being transferred from molecule to molecule. While that's happening, oxygen is taking on the electrons. The protons are actually building up in the space right outside the cytoplasm of the mitochondria. Now, the reason that's important is because this protein, called ATP synthase, is in that inner mitochondrial membrane. And the protein itself catalyzes the phosphorylation of ADP. It makes it happen really fast. But the protein is not happy unless protons are passing through it. Now, I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. This is amazing physiology here. There is a protein in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it is actually a channel for protons. We've seen proteins